Hello there, and welcome to day 119 of A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And I return to the MCU rewatch, now deep into Phase 2. And unfortunately, as I said in my Iron Man 3, this does mean we're going through the first major shaky period in the cinematic universe. Because today I look at Thor: The Dark World. When I watched Iron Man 3 back, as I said at the time, there are things in it that do work. You know, there are plot ideas, characters, arcs. I think really would put it above Iron Man 2. It's just it doesn't come together, and the Mandarin twist and just certain choices that were made knock it back down. But it's clear that it's done by someone with a vision trying to do something creative. And I think Phase 2 is all about the experimentation. You know, they know that they've been able to tell a series of solid films, and now it's a question of, let's put this in the hands of more experimental directors. I would say more experimental. I'm not talking like David Lynch. I'm talking more like, like James Gunn, as we'll later get onto, or Shane Black. And so the problem there is you do end up with... It's a risk because you end up with films that, to be honest, are so all over the place in terms of, trying things that sometimes work, sometimes don't. They create a tone, they fail to meet a tone, particularly in sequels. And Phase 2, mercifully, starts weak and gets solid, but not before we get to probably the worst film in the phase, and one of the worst Marvel films, I think, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is Thor: The Dark World. Thor: The Dark World, there is nothing ostensibly wrong with it. This was the problem I had watching the film, which is, as I'm going through it, there isn't anything it's doing wrong. It's not like the Mandarin twist in Iron Man 3, or the tonal inconsistency where it goes from quite adult dealing with post-traumatic stress to slightly more humorous interactions with a child. It's fairly consistent, and I think it's trying to be fairly consistent with the first Thor film. And yet, on some intangible level, it doesn't work. It just fails outright. And I'm going to try to dissect why that is, but frankly, I came to the end of the film not really with a solid understanding of why this film just doesn't work. I mean, like with Iron Man 2, it does fall into the trap of wanting to acknowledge everything in the original film. So we have broadly, all of the same characters from the first film who are given, varying levels of importance depending on whether, for instance, you have the Warriors 3 return, although I think one, maybe two of them have now been recast. And so they get lip service. We have Lady Sif, even though she doesn't really have a great deal to do. We have all the other Asgardians who we'd expect, like Heimdall and Odin and Freya and of course Loki. And yes, they do have more direct relevance to the film, but trying to cram them in, as well as putting, of course, we have Jane Foster coming back. We have Darcy. We have Eric Selwig. So we have that team from the original film as well coming back. So it's clearly trying to sort of refer to all the things in the first one, like Iron Man 1 did in Iron Man 2. And that doesn't work because a narrative needs to stride its own course. It needs to go, okay, there are things in that we'll want to continue, but we shouldn't be married to the idea of bringing them back. And so the problem initially with this film is because it's got so many and characters to deal with that we already know, alongside the new characters, it has a real pacing issue where the first Thor, quite smartly, focused almost entirely in Asgard for the first act, Then for the second act, focused on here, and then the third act brought Asgard and Earth together, or sort of jumped between the two. Whereas this film, because it wants to refer to Jane and see what she's doing, and obviously what the Asgardians are doing, and Thor's bouncing around to different worlds, it so jumps between from Asgard to Earth, back to Asgard to somewhere else, to the Dark World, back to Asgard, and it does give you a bit of whiplash where it's like, okay, can't we just spend some time in one setting? And then you have things like the introduction of new characters like Chris O'Dowd or Jonathan No, it's not Jonathan Richardson. There's a character who's the intern of Darcy, and his character. I feel bad for the actor because the actor. I looked at his filmography, and he's not like quite at the sort of profile level of people like Natalie Portman or Chris Hemsworth, but there's no reason he should be. That a film like this should allow a less well-known actor the opportunity to be lifted, and they could always find something brilliant. But he's kind of out of place. He has such a minor role that he's almost it feels frustrating to have a random character there. And then you have Chris O'Dowd's character, who is supposed to be... I mean, he's only in 2 scenes, but again, I suppose the problem from my perspective as a Brit is that Chris O'Dowd is a fairly recognised actor, at least from his time on IT Crowd. And then, of course, he got a bit more famous from being in Bridesmaids as the love interest. And yet, here he's there for really a bit, like a bit part, where it's just to go, we need something for this scene, and we need something for this scene, and he can fill that space. And it's actually rather frustrating because, for one, those 2 characters, the intern, Darcy's intern, and the Chris O'Dowd, you could almost merge into one character in terms of the plot mechanics of what they're needed for. And yet both of them really feel like they stick out. Of course, you now introduce Christopher Eccleston playing Malekith, the leader of the Dark Elves, and you have a few other Dark Elves characters. And this is the thing that people lay the blame at most of all, which is the Dark Elves are really generic, very boring villains who frankly are there to do something for the heroes to fight, but there's no real emotional tie. And frankly, I feel bad, particularly for Christopher Eccleston. Christopher Eccleston is an actor who, over the course of his career, at least in 2000 and 2010s, has really had a hard time, particularly with genre stuff, and things that really, were going to give him the biggest of profiles, like, of course, Doctor Who, which, of course, everyone loves Christopher Eccleston's time on Doctor Who, but he did not have a good time working on it and left under a veil of tension between him and the production. And only now he's decided to come back to the role in Big Finish in audio. Then you have him in G.I. Joe, Rise of Cobra, which, okay, it's just a silly G.I. Joe film, but again, it could have been the beginning of a new franchise, and he has the prominent villain role in it. But it wasn't, it failed. And then, of course, you have this. It's a Marvel film. This is a big role. And again, it falls flat on his face, and people say, Christopher Eccleston was one of the worst Marvel villains. Malekith is one of the worst characters, but it's not his fault. I mean, partly because of the fact that he and several of the other villains spend most of the film speaking in another language, a fictional language, to each other. And I think that's one of the big problems, which is we are given a reason for why they hate Asgardians broadly, which is the war between Odin's father, Bor, which is shown in a prologue, the massacre of the Dark Elves, the fact they got trapped and now they're returning. But there's no personal relationship between the villains and the heroes. The only thing is when Malekith kills Freyja, Thor's mother, and of course then that gives it a personal vendetta. But again, in their interactions, the interactions between Thor and Malekith are kind of lame and boring, and very much like it's very clear that, like, in terms of like writing for the villain, that he barely even knows who he's fighting. He's just an obstacle, and so that is wildly frustrating because it's just like, oh well, it's very difficult to have a good superhero film when you don't have a particularly good villain. And then you have the other problem, which is the fight scenes between. There are two prominent fight scenes that sort of. I mean, there are more set pieces and bigger battles, but in terms of fights, there's the two that come to my mind are Thor and Loki versus the Cursed, one of the agents of Malekith, and then the fight between Thor and Malekith. And in that fight, the first one, Loki is supposed to have died, and in the second one, it's the big climactic fight. Frankly, they're both very lame fights. They feel very flat. In terms of the action, I kind of lost interest in them. I wasn't even really looking at the actual fighting and the battle. And again, there's just no real emotional reason. It's just generic monster fights heroes, and in the end, generic villain fights Thor. And it's dull. It's dull, and I can't quite put my finger on whether it's the choreography, the CG, the writing, but it's just so boring. Yeah, so it's these are all the things to lay at the feet of this film, and they knock it far down. They really do. I mean, there are things that I like in it. For instance, Loki is frankly the best thing in it. I do think that Tom Hiddleston, and I'm so glad we're getting the Loki TV series, because I do think Tom Hiddleston, as much as Chris Hemsworth is great, Chris Hemsworth's great, particularly working against people, whereas Tom Hiddleston is a scene stealer. He's a chew the scenery level of, oh, I want to know what his next lines are going to be or what he does, and he shows it in this and in the Avengers and onwards from this point. But he's great in it, and you have Chris Hemsworth and Idris Elba and Natalie Portman and Anthony Hopkins, and they're all doing the stuff they did the first time, and they're all good at what they're doing. The issues aren't the performances. I don't know. It's just I assume it either has to be laid at the feet of the writing or the direction. Now, it was directed by Alan Taylor, who had to look him up because he isn't a particularly well-known film director, and frankly, this is one of the 4-5 films that he directed. He's prominently known for TV, and he is well known for being a TV director. I mean, he did things like Lost, Boardwalk Empire. He's gone on to be to go direct some episodes of Game of Thrones. He's a very well-respected television director and has been nominated for many primetime Emmys. And I don't know if it's the transition between being a film, that there is a difference between being a television and a film director. And I don't know, I couldn't tell you what they were, but I think there is, you can see there is a difference. And some TV directors easily transition into film directing, but if there's anything I can say about this, I assume he did not find this an easy transition, because again, he didn't go on to do many films after this. He is known for TV, and I wonder if that's something he really struggled. This type of doing a film like this, he really struggled with. I often wonder now whether the MCU were trying something, because he is, like I say, he's not a big name like Shane Black, like Joss Whedon, like Kenneth Branagh, and I do wonder whether they were trying something, whether the MCU were like, well, we've got the formula down, and if we are just consistent, if we just have, these kind of directors, we don't have to go for the big showy directors because they obviously cost more. And then they tried it and it didn't work, so then of course they've gone on for James Gunn, I want to say the Safdie brothers, but that's not right at all. The Russo, thank you. The Russo brothers. I don't know. I genuinely don't, but all I can discuss is the results. And the results are, it is an incredibly flat film. And I think that's the problem with it. It feels like characters just doing things, and the emotional stakes are not there. You know, even certain things like Jane reconnecting with Thor, their chemistry exists because the actors can breathe a little life into it, but it's still quite flat. I know that many of the actors had a bad time working on this, notably Anthony Hopkins. Natalie Portman really didn't enjoy this. Idris Elba. I know that this wasn't a well-liked film from the actor's perspective, and I wonder if that also impacted the results of it, the actual output. Because like I said, it's funny because I've broken down all these things that I think are the cause of why it's bad, but they feel more like symptoms. The root cause is hard to say. You know, it's very hard to say exactly why this doesn't work, but it doesn't. And I don't know yet if I would say this is the bottom of my MCU list, but off the top of my head, I can't think of one that I have probably had a worse time with. I think, if I remember rightly, this popped into my head, and another reason why Natalie Portman, I think this was originally going to be directed by Patty Jenkins, who then had to leave the project. Which would explain why they would bring in Alan Taylor as sort of a last minute replacement. I'm not sure what that works in the broader sort of scope of it, but that sort of just popped into my head. But yeah, this wasn't a terrible watch, but it was a dull film, and I will always say, I'm sure I've said before, I can watch a bad film. I struggle to watch a dull film because, you know, there's nothing worse you can do in cinema than bore me. But yeah, I'm glad I got through this, and we have some real highs coming with of course Winter Soldier, Guardians. So I'm glad I just managed to climb over this one. Anyway, thank you for joining me. Please hit the like button if you liked the video. Subscribe to the channel. Please do check my 100 plus videos that are already up. And please hit that little bell to get notifications for when new uploads arrive. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I'm always tweeting movie-related content and news and funny videos. And of course, links to these videos when they go up. Thank you for joining me. Take care.